It's not quite 6:30. Are we live?
We are streaming.
Okay, it's 6:30. Welcome, everyone. We'll call to order this meeting of the Finance and Personnel Committee for the City of Middleton. Can we start with the roll call, please, Bill?
Jackson,
Here.
Heniro,
Here.
Lorman,
Here.
all present.
All right, great. First item of business is the approval of the minutes of our June 18th Finance and Personnel Committee meeting. Are there any corrections or changes to the minutes? I gave Bill a few earlier today, just regarding names for motions, and he's made those
So it should
changes.
be corrected in the packet now.
Okay, they're in the packet corrected. Any further discussion? Hearing none, I will accept the minutes as approved with those two changes. Next item is the audit of the bills. Do you have any updates for us, Bill?
No updates or additions tonight.
Okay, then can I have a motion to approve the audit of the bills?
This is Jackson. I'll make a motion to approve the order of the bills.
Thank you.
Second.
Any discussion? All right, I have a motion and a second. So all those in favor of approving the audit of the bills signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Right, the ayes have it. Next is resolutions. We have one. It's resolution 2024-33, amending the 2024 Public Lands Capital Projects budget for the Path Surface Treatment Project. And I get a motion in a second, and then we'll discuss.
I'll make a motion.
This is Jackson. I'll second.
All right, thank you. Discussion.
Sort of curious. As to the movement of money around in terms of, it's not a lot of money, but it's money nonetheless. It's $44,715. Sort of kind of recall a conversation a year or so ago, and a desire to want to update and do markings and do trail markings and things. Seems like now we're taking money away from that.
Kylie, would you like to take the podium?
Maybe. Oh, there you go. So make sure we're not kind of walking backwards on something we said we would do.
Yeah, so the project for the trail marking and delineation, we're planning on getting all my directions here, that one edge of Pheasant Branch Conservancy, all surveyed out from, Highway, Highland Way Road. I cannot remember the road over by the community garden right up there,
Mhm.
all the way to Orchid Heights Park. As we're trying to do that large section of Pheasant Branch with our restoration efforts that we're doing in the prairie restoration on that side. So we're planning on doing that, and we have the funds that we have in that account are enough to complete that project. So that's where we're looking at gathering funds to help complete the other project with the trail network and the seal coating.
So so you don't have any other signage or trail marking projects open for the 2024 fiscal year? Other than what you just
Not right,
told me about.
or not this year.
This year.
I think that for trail marking and delineation, we would really want to put an awesome sign, wayfinding plan together. I don't think that's what was in the narrative for that line item or that capital request, to do really a whole signage plan.
Okay.
And then for I believe it was more meant for delineation, and surveying property lines. And so we're trying to accomplish a large section of that this year, and truck through that project.
You have a question?
Works for me.
Okay. Did you have any questions, Joe? And just, I spoke to Bill about this one earlier, because I couldn't remember this project being in the budget for this year or last year, and I didn't find it in the year before, and Bill explained this is a carried over project from 2020. This funding
Correct.
has,
Yes. it
Yes.
is.
right, and it's not the staff's fault that it's carried over that much, but to get to your question about the trail marking and delineation, I think this the surface treatment for the paths has been postponed just because of circumstances. So I'm glad to see it go forward. I did suggest two things to Bill, and we talked about it. One is keeping the year of the original project in the project number, because if I had seen project 20 dash, I think it's 129, I would know, oh, this one's from a few years ago. And that's why, that's why we need to go forward with it now. But then the other thing is the amount of money that is being moved is so small. I regret that you had to, or that anyone had to put together a resolution to get this approved. It seems to me, back when I had federal cooperative agreements, we could move money around up to a certain threshold, and that threshold was bigger than $10,000. And so I'm hopeful that in the future we can consider changing our policies so that something below a threshold like $10,000 doesn't have to go through the process of having a resolution and being on this agenda and the council agenda. It just seems like a waste, I don't want to say a waste of staff time, but you all have more important things to be doing. One other question I had is, what will this do to the Lakeview East Park improvements, since a small amount's coming from that?
Yeah, the Lakeview East Park improvements, we haven't really nailed down that entire project yet. I believe that there's a lot of opportunity for that area. We did a concept plan for that when we did the Lake Street, and the Lake Street kind of overarched that plan and got set aside a little bit more than I'd like to see something a little bit more concrete. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for playground equipment and trail connectivity throughout that park.
Great. Okay. Any other questions? Hearing none, all those in favor of approving resolution 2024-33, amending the 2024 Public Lands Capital Projects budget for the Path Surface Treatment Project, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Nope, the ayes have it. We'll move on to agreements and contracts, and we have two. The first one is the agreement with Veerbicker Associates for design engineering and bid services for Franklin Avenue reconstruction, and this comes to us from the Public Works Committee.
Or on behalf of Public Works, Orman. This
Great.
request.
You'll second
This is
that?
Jackson. I'll second.
Thank you. Discussion. This is for services this year for construction that will take place next year. Got it. All right. There being no questions or comments, all those in favor of approving the agreement with Veerbicker Associates for design engineering and bid services for Franklin Avenue reconstruction, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The ayes have it. The second agreement is the city developer agreement for Red Tail Ridge First Edition Phase 2. And this also comes to us from the Public Works Committee.
Sure, on behalf of Public Works. Go ahead with this.
Okay, and on behalf of my district, I'd like to second it. This is Red Tail Ridge is in my district. All right, discussion. Bill, do you want to give us a quick rundown?
Yeah, this is a standard city development agreement that outlines the responsibilities for both the city and developer for the development of this phase. There are several references to fees that are included within the exhibits. There are several items that are subject to final adjustment based on the final details of the subdivision plat, or excuse me, the subdivision phase. So I would recommend that it be approved subject to city attorney approval. If there's more specific questions or information, Sean Stowski is probably the best person to address that.
Okay, could you bring up the, I think there are 9 contingencies. So there were 3 policy matters. These are similar to the ones for the previous city developer agreement for the first phase.
Correct.
Okay, so those I didn't have any issues with the first time and I don't now. And then there are 9, I think I counted correctly, there are 9 contingencies and the deferred effective date should be July 31st.
Correct.
Okay, so I'll make a substitute motion to recommend that to the council that they approve the agreement as recommended by the Public Works Committee with the 3 policy-related edits, a deferred effective date upon the completion of the 9 listed contingencies, no later than July 31st, and subject to review and approval by the city attorney. Did I capture what you need?
I think that'll do. Yeah. And just as an update, as of this afternoon, most of the staff review comments are taken care of.
Great. All right, so that was my substitute motion. Would anyone like to second it?
This is Jackson. I'll second that.
All right, further questions or comments for Sean? I had one comment on page 33 of the packet. Assume it's the same. And it was question about the word calculate not being necessary, and I agreed it was not necessary.
Well,
Minor.
that one we did take out.
You did, okay, good. And then, Sean, do you know, is the first park going to be built in phase 2? It looked like the park is part of phase 2.
I'm sorry, what? I'm
If you go to
lost.
page 51. So that's where calculate can be removed, but then page 51. It looks like that park, actually the Bellefontaine Boulevard with multi-use paths is pointing right to where the parkland. Do you see it?
Up and to the left now. Go.
Yes, see where it says future phase? Go to the left. That green space, isn't that a park?
That's in the plat as a public park.
Right, and looks like it's part of phase 2 of the,
It is part of phase 2. Yep.
Okay, great.
That's part of this public improvement.
well, that'll be exciting. And we have no idea when that's going to be built.
They want to start next week, but we got to get these documents approved.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, I was just up there walking the other day. It's amazing to see how many units are already lived in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Okay,
their intention is to have this work, the public improvements, completed before the end of this year.
great. Okay, any other questions, comments for Sean? Hearing none, all those in favor of recommending that council approve the city developer agreement for Red Tail Ridge First Edition Phase 2 as recommended by the Public Works Committee with the 3 policy-related edits, a deferred effective date upon the completion of the 9 listed contingencies no later than July 31st, 2024, and subject to review and approval by the city attorney, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? All right, the ayes have it. Thanks, Sean.
Mhm.
The next item is bids and quotes. We have one. It's the award of bid to Farner Asphalt Sealers LLC in the amount of $67,300 for path surface treatments. That's the project we just were talking about. Who would like to move approval?
Norman will approve the pass treatment for Farner Asphalt.
This is Jackson. I'll second.
Great. Any discussion? I had one question, and that is just when will this work be done? Do we know?
It's planned to be done by the end of August, hopefully before Good Neighbor Fest
Okay.
weekend.
Thank you. Okay, all those in favor of approving the award of bid to Farner Asphalt Sealers LLC in the amount of $67,300 for path surface treatments, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, the ayes have it. We'll move on then to our last item, which is 2025 budget process kickoff presentation, part 2, and discussion. Bill?
Yeah, thank you. I'll get this up. Okay. Yeah, tonight we want to build on the information that we had provided in the part 1, which provided more general context for the city's budget, and talk specifically about some of the items that we're projecting for 2025, and then looking at our 5-year projection going forward. As I go through this, I will say that these are all preliminary estimates. We are getting budget worksheets and forms ready to send out to departments by mid-July, with department budget requests due back mid-August. So we'll be getting additional information from departments as well as on revenues and state aids as we go through the process. But this represents our best estimate at this point in time based on 6 months of information this year. So we'll run through revenue and expenditure estimates, talk about the stormwater utility referendum and the potential impacts on the 2025 budget, look at our 5-year operating budget forecast, and then come back to the budget development calendar and timeline. So looking first at the revenue estimates, we've put together our best guess at this point in the year of where we anticipate our general fund revenues being. The largest revenue, as you know, is taxes, and specifically property tax revenue. And that's the first category that's listed here, which represents about 60% of the general fund budget. And that is controlled by the levy limit and our net new construction limit of about 1.6%. When we factor in personal property aid and other items in total for that category, we're looking at about a 1.4% increase. In other taxes, pilots, and assessments, the largest item there is room tax revenue. That has been growing well the last couple of years as it's recovered from the pandemic. At this point, we only have the first quarter revenues. Second quarter room tax revenue will be due at the end of July, so we'll have a better estimate for that in another month or so. The other categories, as you see then, are other governmental revenue and state aid, local revenues such as licenses, permits, fees, fines, forfeitures, charges for services. I will touch on a couple of those in upcoming slides. I wanted to touch on this slide on just a couple of the items towards the bottom where you see decreases. Under interdepartmental and interagency charges, that for 2024 included the use of ARPA money that's helping to support additional election costs for the presidential election. So that revenue will come out of the general fund, but so will the associated expenses related to that. The other part of that line is money received from the TIF districts as part of the TID 3 cost recovery, and that will continue to go down as that's phased out. Investment income, we are at 6 months through the year. This year, I'm still seeing strong investment returns, try to be somewhat conservative looking at next year, but I think that this is a reasonable estimate based on what we're projecting for 2025. And then under the miscellaneous and other sources, that's also showing a decrease. The primary reason for that is the 2024 budget included the budgeted use of carryover funds. So with that carryover being used, that's another situation where both that source of funding and the related expenditures for that will be dropping off from the 2025 budget. So in total, this is showing a 1.2% increase. If we factor in those one-time items for the ARPA money for the elections and the carryovers, it's actually about a 2.2% increase overall. It's a little better, but still below the rate of inflation. So looking at a couple of specific revenues that I wanted to highlight, property taxes is the city's largest revenue. That is based on our net new construction under the levy limit. Our estimated net new construction based on information from the city assessor is a 1.63% increase. We'll have the actual numbers from the state of Wisconsin in August. At that level, that would provide about a $250,000 increase in our property tax levy. And to put that in context, that only represents about 1% of our total general fund budget. This slide we had in part 1, but I included it here as well because I think it's really important to highlight. This shows the change in the percentage of net new construction over time for the last several years. And it had been that we were averaging between 2 and 2.5%. We had a couple strong years, as you see here in 2018 and 2019, that were around 3%. But the trend line that we're seeing is that has been decreasing over time. And we're now looking at a couple of years of below 2% growth in net new construction. We are hopeful that with some of the development, including the project that we were talking about earlier tonight, we may see some increases in future years. But although there are ups and downs in given years, the trend line is going down. And I think that's primarily for two reasons. First, that, as you know, Middleton has relatively few new growth areas and is largely relying on redevelopment in order to fuel that net new construction growth. And the second is just as our city's tax base continues to grow and get larger, it takes more and more development to keep that same percentage change in net new construction. And I think this is something that's really important to highlight with the way property tax levy limits are set up in Wisconsin, that there is no inflationary component. See, the only way your tax base growth can grow is for that new construction, which is a very limiting factor, especially when inflation's over 3%. Turning to some of the other revenues that I wanted to highlight, this slide summarizes the major state aids for the general fund. The first line, shared revenue, this is the area that was increased with the recent Wisconsin Act 12 adjustment, so that's included within that base. We are anticipating that there'll be some growth in that over time based on the growth of the state sales tax. Right now, we're estimating 2.5%, which was an early estimate from the state when Wisconsin Act 12 passed. We don't have the actual percentage for 2025 yet, but we'll update that as we go forward. City's still receiving a little bit of expenditure restraint aid. That has been going down, and we anticipate that 2025 will likely be the last year that we qualify because our tax rate is dropping below the minimum for that program. The way the expenditure restraint aid program works, you have to have a local tax rate of at least $5 per thousand. And then if you limit the growth of your budget to a certain factor, which does include inflation, you qualify for the aid. But under the continued growth in property values and the combination of that with levy limits, Middleton is now below $5 per thousand, and we're anticipating that it will likely continue to be below that and not qualify for a payment after 2025. State road aids is our largest area of state aid for the general fund. That is calculated based on a formula that factors in the amount of available funding at the state level and looking at a 6-year average of our costs. 2% is an estimate. We will have a better idea as we get farther into the year. There is some potential that may go up higher than the 2% based on our actual costs compared to the overall pie. And with Pleasant View Road and some of the other larger projects we've had, that may help us in that category. Fire insurance dues has helped to fund expenditures for the Middleton Fire District. That has been increasing by about 5% per year. But the other state aid categories that are listed here are set dollar amounts and generally do not increase. I do have an asterisk on the last one, which is the personal property aid. As a result of the changes to make personal property fully tax exempt starting with this coming budget and tax year, we are anticipating that there will be an increase in that personal property aid. However, there will be a corresponding decrease in our levy limit. So that number will go up based on the exempted property, but my understanding is that our levy limit will go down by that same dollar amount. So it's intended to hold us even, but not be an additional revenue generator for the city. Next revenue to highlight is looking at the funds that are provided to the general fund from the city's TIF districts. This has also been known as the TIF cost recovery. And at its peak, the city was transferring about $1.8 million per year from TIF district number 3 to the general fund to provide funding for general fund services provided to the TIF district, especially for public safety services. The city has for several years been working to phase that out in anticipation that at the end of the TIF expenditure period in 2025, we will no longer be able to make those payments from TIF district number 3. So you can see the history of that being reduced over time. There was a larger reduction in 2022 when we took advantage of a levy limits adjustment from a TIF subtraction to make a larger reduction. And then in 2024's budget, we began phasing in a smaller, more focused administrative fee from TID 5, really focused on costs to administer the TIF district from administration, planning, finance, rather than such a broad cost recovery. The plan, as we've laid out, would be in 2025, we would further reduce the TIF 3 payment. We would add some more to that TID 5 administrative cost. The net reduction to the general fund is 125,000. And then we would make the final adjustment in 2026 for another 125,000. And then that would just be the TIF 5 administration payment going forward after that.
Bill, can I ask about that?
Yeah.
What will that $250,000 cover?
It's intended to cover a portion of time for city administrator, for finance, and for planning primarily, plus some of the overhead for things like building and IT services related to those departments. It's a similar formula to what we've been doing for cost allocations to the utilities for water, sewer, and now stormwater.
Okay, and the 250,000, I mean, that would conceivably be adjusted up for inflation over time, but is that about the cap that you see?
Yeah, that was the thought, that we would have a formula that looks at a percentage of time for those people on the TIF team. So this would be phased in to ramp up, and then from there, it would increase based on inflation as the budgets sent for those positions and departments grow, but you wouldn't see large adjustments like this.
Okay, thanks.
And I should add too, that if at some point in the future, the city were to create another TIF district, then we would look at allocating those costs between the active TIF districts. Next revenue to highlight is investment income. I put this slide in here really to illustrate how much of a swing we've seen in investment income, because that's so tied to changes in interest rates. And we went from a period of extremely low interest rates near zero to now with short-term rates at over 5%. So you can see that we had been under $200,000 in revenue and for investments in the general fund. That grew in 2019. Then we saw a drop in interest rates and saw that drop significantly. And then we saw market adjustments impacting 2022 and a big return in investment yields in 2023. On average, over this time period, investment income for the general fund has been $451,000. We received over $1.2 million in 2023. At this point in 2024, investment income is also looking very strong for this year. However, there is a lot of thought that interest rates at some point are going to start to come down, and looking to 2025, we want to be somewhat conservative and not build such a large number into our budget that in the future, when rates go down, we have difficulty filling that gap. So kind of looking at this, our estimate as a starting point for 2025 is $750,000. I feel comfortable with the investments that we've been reinvesting funds, and in going out 3 to 5 years that we will have income for at least a period of time going forward that we can lock in at higher rates. But I don't want to go too far in that estimate and then create a problem for us in a future budget. From there, I will turn to the expenditures, and I'm going to turn it over to Brian Wohlhopter, who's going to walk through some of the personnel estimates.
So we've just begun discussions with the police union and their upcoming contract. It ends at the end of this year. We'll have a new contract for next year. We actually began in February in earnest with them. We have reworked pretty much the entire administrative portion of the contract, brought all the MOUs and side letters back into the singular contract, things that had been there for years and years. So we've done some extensive work with them. We have not discussed economics yet, and I don't anticipate us discussing economics till fall. So we'll have a better idea of what that may look like once we start that discussion with the police. For EMS, we're in the last year of our contract with the paramedics. This COLA in their table, plus steps in their table, plus increases dedicated to their scheduled overtime is about 2.75 plus COLA steps for this next year. And then next year, we'll be negotiating a new successor contract with them. The non-union COLA right now is projected at 2%. We typically try to follow the ECI published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The last published ECI was 4.8% growth over the last year. The next one comes out at the end of this month, but unofficial predictions from BLS is that the ECI, an increase should be about 5% year over year. So we're significantly behind where we would want to be to maintain our pay in sync with local and state government figures nationally. Locally, CIVMIC has done some surveys. Those numbers are looking 3.5% and higher for some of our peers, but very few have reported yet. So not sure where they'll all come in. Given our non-union market adjustments, where we take a look at moving people to and through the midpoint of their ranges, the adjustments will run at the lowest, 0.25%, at the highest, 2%. For this year, the median increase dedicated to market adjustments is 1%. The average is 1.23%. So we still have more than half on the lower half of our pay scale. It has improved from last year, though. Health insurance preliminary estimate is for about a 7.75% increase. We are out of our 3-year lock with SSM. We completed that initial agreement with them. So we will see. Our broker is out there working with SSM right now. So I expect we'll have some preliminary numbers by the end of the month. And from that, we'll go back and renegotiate for the best numbers we can get to include contract locks going forward. Nationally, increases are expected to be in the average of 8 to 9%. ETF is expected to be in double digits again this year. So if we were able to hold ourselves to 7.75% increase, that would be good.
Any thought of looking at a different provider?
We are considering that, and we have asked our brokers to give us some feedback in that area. Would a different provider provide us a lower rate? Would a different provider provide us some better service? We have had some service issues with SSM too. So we're exploring those options. When we have some more feedback, then we'll be able to provide it. Right now, the broker is simply canvassing and trying to provide some information to us.
Okay, and I recall that we started giving not a bonus, but a payment for people who waive the health insurance. Has that helped at all with the cost of health insurance?
Maybe.
Yeah.
There's differing directions on that. So part of that is an equity benefit, so that those that were not paying $17,000 towards insurance for, they are still seeing a benefit. I do believe that has swung some new employees towards taking that instead of taking insurance, but it's really difficult to tell whether it's a net increase or a net leveling of benefits across all employees. Dental insurance, I estimate we'll have no increase in our dental insurance premium. We have not had an increase in our dental insurance premium in the 4 years I've been with the city. It has stayed at the same rate. I expect that it will stay the same rate again, unless we were to make some plan changes. WRS, unfortunately, did increase for this year. So general employees had a 0.5% increase. So the city will contribute that much, and they will be deducted that much from each paycheck. For protective services, there was a 0.65% increase for the city's contribution to that. Again, they only give the general employee percentage. So the employees themselves had a 0.5% increase. So that was a little unexpected. We expected WRS to remain at the same levels this year, but it wasn't as big of an increase as we've seen in previous years. These are the general fund preliminary expenditures. Some of the personnel information is on there. These are the hard numbers that go against those percentages we previously talked about.
Yeah, for 2025, and these are our preliminary estimates, but trying to look at those range of percentages of what that might be in dollar amounts, and we'll get more specific with that as we go through the process. In addition to the personnel line items and benefits that Brian talked to, the last few items that are on here We looked at operating line items. Again, this is before any of the department requests came in, but looking at our history, we estimated between various line items, somewhere between 0.5% and 1% increase. I'm sure there'll be some line items that'll be going up faster than that, but potentially some that can be held constant. So that's an estimate of 65,000. We also have transfers in the general fund to the library and youth center and transit. So we've included some estimates for the additional costs in those areas. And then the contingency, as you recall, we had funded our general contingency at $100,000 in 2024. The increase of 69,000 would be if we were able to get in compliance with our policy, which identifies a target of 2/3 of 1% of the general fund budget. So to be determined if we're able to reach that amount, but wanted to include that as a starting point. And then the last item on here, reductions from the prior year budget, those relates to the items that I was mentioning on the revenues, the ARPA funding for the presidential election. Those additional election costs can come back to a base year amount because of the off year, as well as some of the one-time retention payments that were funded with carryover. So in total, this early estimate, we're looking at about 411,000. And if you'll recall back on the revenue page, we were looking at potentially around 310,000 or so of additional revenue. So we are looking at as a gap at a starting point. That's before getting into detail. So I do feel confident that in putting together a recommended budget, we'd be able to put together options to be able to balance that gap. But did want to emphasize that this is just base cost to continue before looking at any new services or any new positions. With that, turn it over to Brian again, just to mention some of the areas that are anticipated requests.
Yeah, these are the requests we've already received or we're aware of.
Mhm.
We are also aware of some additional requests we haven't received hard requests for. They're still in discussion. None of these are a surprise. Some of them have carried over year to year. The bottom one, obviously, stormwater utility staffing, that'll be totally contingent on approval of referendum and establishing the staffing for that.
Can I ask about the police department staffing? So when you see patrol officers are on there, did we succeed in filling the 2 positions that were funded through the referendum?
We have succeeded in filling the 2 positions from the referendum and the 7 positions that we lost to other agencies or resignations, and the 2 positions that we lost to promotions. And on August 5th, we will be 100% staffed in the police department.
And I see the dispatcher request. Do other municipalities don't do their own dispatch, correct?
Yeah, we are one of the few municipalities that have their own dispatch.
Okay,
Just add it.
Brian and Bill?
There are some communities that have their own dispatch, not, it is not a majority in Dane County. There, I think, what, are a handful, 3, maybe 4 that have it, but the majority use Dane County. But Monona's one, we're one. I think there's one other one that also does their own, Sun Prairie does their own dispatch. Yep.
Have we ever looked into doing that? I mean, would that help us financially, especially now that, I don't know if the, innovation grants from the state would be applicable to this situation?
Yeah, I can touch on it. In the time that I've been with the city, which is approximately 8 years, there have not been in-depth discussions looking at that. I think it's been mentioned as something that could be looked at, although I know that I think all of the public safety agencies feel strongly that there are a lot of benefits of having local dispatch. As far as the question about the innovation grant, there's still additional rulemaking and information that needs to come out in the state on how that is going to be implemented. I think it potentially could be something that would apply if there's a net cost savings for a transfer of service. But more details are to come on that.
Okay, and then I recall there was a personnel study done for the police department. I think it was from 2018. Any thought of updating that study to see where we stand?
There has been no specific discussion of updating the police personnel study. I do believe that we are due for a whole organizational study to include the police department and all the other operational departments. Fitchburg just completed one, so that's something that we perhaps could consider later in the year. But there hasn't been any discussion of redoing alone the police study.
Okay, I like the idea of a more comprehensive one because I feel like, I know in the short time I've been on council, that study has been cited as the reason to add more officers. And I've felt like other departments were at a disadvantage because they didn't have a staffing study to demonstrate that they too needed more personnel to get the work done. So, so I would love to see a comprehensive study done.
Okay. From there, turning to the stormwater utility referendum, included this information because it is a key item for this year's budget coming forward. As you know, council has approved going forward with a referendum in November of this year. If approved, the anticipation is that the rate would increase to 23 per ERU per quarter beginning next year, which would support 2 stormwater utility positions as well as additional maintenance and capital projects. One thing that I wanted to highlight, in addition to funding these positions and funding items that are not currently being done within the stormwater utility due to lack of staffing and funding, there is an opportunity to potentially shift some costs that are currently being funded in the general fund, property tax supported, to the utility if the referendum does pass. Given that and given the timeline of the referendum that wouldn't be held until the beginning of November and adoption of the budget plan for mid-November, I anticipate that we'll be in a situation where we'll want to develop a recommended budget, assuming that the referendum passes, but also have available what the impact would be, kind of a second budget for both the stormwater utility and the general fund, if that does not pass and this cannot be funded, and if the potential movement of some of those costs to the utility versus tax support is not able to take place. This is just a summary of information that is from the stormwater utility rate study that was prepared earlier this year. And in looking at this, my estimate is that there's approximately $100,000 out of that operation and maintenance for things like storm sewer maintenance, street cleaning, and brush pickup currently funded in the general fund that potentially could be available to shift to the utility if the referendum were to pass. And then finally, this again is based on information from the rate study, but just presenting graphically where Middleton currently is and where the proposed rate would be compared to other peers in Dane County with their stormwater utility rates.
Can I just say, I think it
Yep.
would be useful to see that chart with the, you know, the stormwater utility on one y-axis and another one showing the mill rate for the different municipalities. That might be something to have for our future public information materials.
From there, moving to our 5-year operating budget projection, and this takes some of the specific assumptions that we're looking at for 2025 and then adds for 26 and 28 additional assumptions going forward. So in general, we've assumed a 2% average annual net new construction for property tax growth, between 2.5% for some of the state aid increases, and depending on the other line items, between a 2 to a 5% increase in revenues. And then we're looking at expenditures of between generally 2.5% to 3.5% for benefits and about 0.5% for operating. Those are pretty conservative assumptions, and they are not building in new staff, just trying to look at what a base level cost to continue would be for the city. And when we project that out over 5 years, you'll see, looking at the bottom line, that there is a gap and a growing gap in the budget. And that is the result of having our revenues at generally 2% or less and below the rate of inflation, and trying to stay close with where personnel and operating costs are. As I had mentioned, for 2025, we're initially at about $100,000 gap. But you can see that grows in 2016 and then keeps building each year thereafter. Looking at that graphically, we're seeing that spread between revenues and expenditures. And that's not something new, I would say that it, if anything, has gotten somewhat worse, that when the city's net new construction was averaging 2.5% and we had 3% per year, it was easier to keep those two in line. But even then, as I'd mentioned in our part one, the city has been doing other things to try to balance that gap. The big one being the referendum that was done to have the $770,000 increase to the levy adjustment, but also other items that have been done to increase the hotel room tax rate that we were able to do to shift public fire protection costs to the water utility customers, to look at increasing other fees and chargebacks to utilities. So I think the reality is that what if inflation and personnel costs continue to increase as they have, and our primary revenue source is limited to just net new construction, we will see gaps unless we find other ways to increase our revenue. And so therefore, going forward and looking at potential strategies for the city, I think in 2025, with a combination of if there were a successful stormwater utility referendum and the ability to shift some costs from the tax levy to the utility, the additional interest income, and trying to look at other ways we can adjust operating costs, hopefully we can close that projected gap for 2025. But I think that the city is going to need to consider other options in the future, and that may be looking at another levy limit referendum, potentially with the closure of TIF District number 3, that would allow for a levy limit adjustment, but currently we're projecting that in 2028, so that's still a few years out. And projecting in the future beyond even 2028, I think the reality that we're in is unless there are new revenue sources or unless levy limit laws are modified to include an inflationary component, we will probably be in a situation where we will need to get on a cycle of going to referendum. And whether it's every 4 years or some other timeline, I think that's the reality that not only we're facing, but I think a lot of municipalities around the state are starting to look at that after years of levy limits, you're just coming to a point where to maintain the level of services, you likely will need to be considering that on some kind of frequency.
Bill, can I ask a question about the multi-year general fund budget projection slide?
Yeah.
I think it's, so does this, I probably missed it. Does this table, the one before, yeah, does this table for preliminary 2025 include the $100,000 shifted from general fund to the utility?
No, that does not.
Okay, so if the estimate is correct at $100,000, we could conceivably
Right, yep.
close that.
Yep.
And then, if I remember correctly, it's recycling that doesn't require a referendum to,
Yeah, correct. The city could impose a fee, a special charge for recycling without going to referendum. To do so for refuse would require a referendum.
okay, and our fee would generate, to cover the costs to us, the fee would have to generate, I think it was $300,000, did I see?
That sounds about right without double checking, but I think it's in that ballpark. Yeah.
Okay. And then much smaller dollar amounts, the pilot and other cost recovery, that to date has not applied to the airport enterprise fund, correct?
Correct.
This year, can it?
I think that's something that we could look at. I think that compared to the other utilities and the golf course, the revenue is much smaller for the airport, but that's something we could look at.
Right. Yeah, I'm just thinking our most highly paid, or maybe one of the most highly paid people is the staff person for the airport enterprise fund. That's a lot of, it's some money that we could recover and should, because it's part of the expense.
Sounds like you're picking on it.
No, I'm just pointing out that this is something that we've shifted in recent years to having the utilities charged for things like the staff services and overhead and all those associated costs. And I don't see why the airport would be singled out for special treatment.
Well, we've done it thus far has made it impossible for the airport to generate additional revenue. Not willing to.
Oh, I think there are ways. But anyway, we'll talk about that, because like you said, you know, we can't, otherwise we're looking at going to a referendum every couple of years. We need to think creatively about how to avoid that.
I think shifting that amount of cost, it's not gonna save the city. What we really have to consider is, you know, when we look at net new construction, you ask yourself, what level of net new construction would we need, right? Realistically, to keep up, okay? Well, if we don't have land available to do it, and we're not willing to aggressively redevelop our major corridors and put 5 and 7-story and beyond apartment buildings up, or level vast tracts of land in the city that have old houses and build new high dense houses, it's not gonna happen. I mean, you know, we're this living status quo in the city. So building a few more houses is not gonna save our budget, you know, without big bold steps. And I'm looking at national trends and the reality of having to levy ourselves every 4 years or 5 years or whatever it takes. I think we have to accept that reality. We can't magically come up with ways to really significantly impact that type of growth and development. And common council's demonstrated the will that we're not willing to necessarily take on large development projects on our major corridors. We don't want 7-story buildings. And we don't have land. Clearly, we're not gonna be able to annex our way around the borders of our city without getting into a war with our neighbors. So,
In the interest of time, Alder Lorman, I'm going to interrupt
Okay.
and say everything needs to be on the table. I know the airport is like the third rail of Middleton politics, and I'm sorry if I
yeah, I mean.
struck a nerve, but
we were just talking-
everything's got to be on the table. And maybe there's a different way to staff the airport commission so that our city administrator doesn't have to be the one spending his time. And our,
That's his choice.
moving on.
Yeah, the last slide I have here is just looking at the budget development calendar. We're here in early July. We'll be having a staff meeting on the budget next week, getting the budget forms out to departments with requests due mid-August. Then we'll be meeting with departments, reviewing those, and working with the mayor and administrator to put together the proposed budget by mid-September. I think the key date to focus on, if there's time to discuss, is trying to find a date for the finance committee budget work session to have the departments come in. Ideally, we'd be looking at sometime between September 16th and the 24th. And doing some initial looking at dates, I think potentially September 16th, 23rd, or 24th might be options, but defer to the committee to have that discussion about what would be an appropriate time.
Looking at the budget work session dates, the 23rd and 24th of September. Do either of you members have possible availability if we did an afternoon meeting? That would make it easier for the staff to not have to come at night.
3rd or 24th of September.
Yep, that's a Monday and a Tuesday.
Take those kind of blocks of time during the day.
Okay, the evening of the 23rd.
That's fine.
Jeff, evening of the 23rd.
Or 24th. That's fine.
I have plan commission at 7, which I would miss if I had to, but we should
We have public works.
We should. broadcast the meeting.
Mm-hmm. 26, 7.
Twenty-sixth. That too late, Bill?
I have a conflict on the
Right,
evening
you're
of the
out of town.
26th.
So what about the 23rd?
I think if 23rd can work, I think that it seems like staff is available on the 23rd.
Okay.
John needs to be here, then we will have to have public works.
Well, maybe it's far enough out that there can be an adjustment for that month. for Public Works? Sean, what do you think?
Well, we can plan on that and just confirm that we can make that work with the committee.
So maybe starting at 5:30 or 6? At 5:30, okay? Okay. All right, so
Okay.
please hold that time on your calendars and Bill will confirm that and schedule it. Okay, is there anything else we needed to talk about related to part 2 of the 2025 budget process kickoff?
That's all I had for today.
All right, hearing no other business, we stand adjourned. 5 minutes.